The Illinois State Fair officially got underway this week, and so did the 2026 general election campaign. From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, August 14th, and this is Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Cast. I'm Peter Hancock, and joining me today are CNI reporters Ben Solinsky and Brendan Moore, and our editor-in-chief, Jerry Nowicki. The Illinois State Fair is a long-standing tradition in the Prairie State for many reasons. Yes, it's a kind of harvest festival and a showcase for Illinois agriculture. It's the place where 4-H youths get to show off their prize cows and goats. And it's also a festival that marks the almost end of summer. And for decades in Illinois, at least in even-numbered years, it has come to mark the time when general election campaigns kick into high gear. Both major parties have their own day at the fair. Democrats will get together on Wednesday the 19th for what's known as Governor's Day. Republicans will rally their troops on Thursday the 20th. Democrats often bring in a big-name national figure to speak at their County Chairs Association brunch in the morning. A few years ago, it was House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Last year, it was House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. And this year, it's Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, a longtime leader of the progressive wing of the party. I got a chance to ask Governor J.B. Pritzker what he expects to hear from Senator Warren when she speaks, and here's what he had to say.
I think she's got a lot to talk to us about. In particular, as you know, she is the one who stewarded the housing bill through the United States Senate and got it done. Even though President Trump wasn't willing to sign it, it went into law anyway, and she just left it there, which is good news. It automatically goes into law. So I'm hoping she'll be talking about that, and then of course about what's the future of the farm bill and making sure that we're helping our farmers across the state and also providing resources for SNAP benefits.
Okay, so I want to turn now to Ben and Brendan. Elizabeth Warren is kind of an interesting choice, especially in a year when Democratic Socialist candidates have been performing pretty well in primaries. Notably, a man named Abdul El Sayed won the Michigan Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate earlier this month. Malat Quiros won a primary for a congressional seat in Colorado. Of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York, and some of her allies in New York also won Democratic primaries earlier this month. Warren does not officially call herself a Democratic Socialist, but she is definitely from the liberal or progressive wing of the party. So I'm wondering, does choosing her as the keynote speaker signal anything about the Illinois Democratic Party? Or is it just a case of her schedule being open during Fair Week? Ben, start with you.
I'm going to go a little bit more with the schedule being open, but also one thing I think that was considered is she is not being considered as a major presidential candidate in 2028. So you wouldn't want, one of these various people who's being considered or talked about as a presidential candidate going up and speaking at an event where Governor Pritzker is also the center of attention because it's his Democratic Party here in Illinois. It would, seem to kind of maybe hurt some of his momentum or something like that here in the state. So I think her choice as the speaker, I think, is largely based on, of course, scheduling, some of the politics of that she's not going to be a competitor for Pritzker in 2028. And the fact that she's still a rather, popular figure among Democrats and, who's, for a long time now been a member of the U.S. Senate.
Brendan, what do you think about that? I mean, the governor mentioned that she did push for this housing bill that became law without the president's signature. Of course, she's been a longtime supporter of consumer financial protection and regulation. What do you make of her choice as the keynote speaker this year?
Yeah, I think, like Ben said, it's the open calendar, but also it's a sign of a strong, healthy Democratic Party of Illinois. that they can bring in a big speaker of her caliber. The past few years, it's kind of traditionally been Senator Dick Durbin's responsibility to bring in the big speaker. He's kind of been the dean of the congressional delegation, and as is mentioned, Speaker Pelosi was here a few years ago. Secretary Pete Buttigieg. I think Senator Catherine Cortez Masto was a year or two ago. So they get some marquee names. And that stands a little bit in contrast to the Illinois Republican Party, which has really struggled, obviously, at the ballot in Illinois, and that's been reflected at the state fair over the past few years. I think the big name a few years ago was Matthew Whitaker, who was acting attorney general in Trump 1. And then there was the chair of the Texas Republican Party, not really a big name. So I think it really is more a reflection of, this is a very healthy, robust party with some heavy hitters who can bring in a big speaker. And, Senator Warren, obviously more to the left of in her party, definitely in the progressive wing. But definitely a mainstream figure, somebody who's very popular with the base, somebody who, the activists that are kind of the lifeblood of the party are going to be excited to hear. And as Ben mentioned, she appears to not be running for president in 2028. So no worry about upstaging Governor J.B. Pritzker, who may be a presidential candidate in a few months or so.
Okay, well, you bring up an interesting point about the Republicans. Of course, they're uniting behind Darren Bailey, who's making his second bid for the governor's office. They also have Don Tracy, a former state party chairman, who's now the candidate for the U.S. Senate. Ben, you were at a candidate forum this week where both Bailey and Tracy appeared, sort of a farm forum. I'm just sort of wondering, what kind of reaction did they get, and did they stir up much enthusiasm?
Yeah, it's hard to say kind of what reaction or how much enthusiasm they got, because the group of farmers they were speaking in front of, a number of them are heavily involved in politics. These are people who are involved with the Soybean Association, the corn growers. These are people who have been around the political block. They know how to welcome a candidate warmly and leave them feeling good about themselves regardless of party. So, I would say the audience was rather welcoming to both candidates, but, Darren Bailey certainly was comfortable in that room. He is a farmer. He speaks their language. He knows the issues that farmers care about because he's dealing with the same things in his business, in his daily life. Governor Pritzker received a warm reception. He has been dealing with these folks for going on 8 full years now. He talked a lot about kind of how he has focused a lot on economic development in the state, which has meant focusing on the growth of farm businesses. Some of the governor's proudest achievements in his 8 years in office have been the various fertilizer plants or other ag businesses that have been able to expand here in the state, and other businesses he's been able to bring to rural communities that may not necessarily be even ag related. So, he certainly made the point that there is a lot to, digest from the businessman's perspective as well, not just, the day-to-day of farming issues.
Well, in that clip we heard from the governor, he also mentioned the farm bill, which I imagine was kind of a major topic of discussion among farmers at that forum. What did you hear about the farm bill? Because it does seem to be kind of snagged in Congress right now.
Yeah, certainly from the farmers' perspectives and the questions that they were submitting to the candidates, disappointment about that the farm bill has not moved forward in Congress, and some folks upset with Democrats for tying, this farm bill to SNAP and wanting to bundle things together. The farmers truly believe that this is a very necessary piece of legislation. They expressed, views that in the past, this is a bill that has been able to pass with bipartisan support. So that's where their frustration with Democrats was coming in, the fact that they were tying other, social service programs, though not entirely unrelated to this farm bill. But it didn't get a ton of attention from Pritzker or Bailey. Don Tracy is the one who focused more on that, given obviously he's the candidate running for Senate. But even then, his point was, I'll be a senator who, is going to put partisan politics aside. I'll work to pass that farm bill. But the farmers did press him noticeably on the fact that he would be the junior senator from Illinois, a freshman in the U.S. Senate, one of 100 members. And, they sounded a little bit skeptical about how much he could actually sway votes on the farm bill, should he be the one to replace Dick Durbin in the U.S. Senate.
Okay, well, we'll be back next week with more from the state fair, including all of the speeches that happened on Governor's Day and Republican Day. Meanwhile, there was other news this week. One story we've been focused on is the Department of Children and Family Services. Capital News Illinois has been engaged in a legal dispute with DCFS over access to some public records. The agency has so far been unwilling to hand over those documents despite a court order to do so. There was a court hearing on that matter earlier this week, and I went down to attend the hearing. And not too surprisingly, DCFS did not show up again. This has been an ongoing issue in this particular matter. Jerry Nowicki, maybe you can help fill us in. Can you remind us of what the underlying case is that brought all of this about?
Yeah, so it all boils down to our reporter Beth Hunsdorfer was looking for some personnel files on the people who were supposed to have been monitoring Mackenzie Felmley, an 18-year-old girl. She died, was found at the bottom of a stairwell in her foster home. She was about 90 pounds, just in terrible shape, just emaciated. And, we're trying to find out the personnel records of the people that were supposed to have kept her safe and, how we got to that point. So we filed the Freedom of Information Act request. It was denied. And so that's when we filed the lawsuit in March. Our attorneys served them with papers notifying them of the lawsuit. Eventually, it went to a hearing on June 10th because DCFS didn't respond. And we filed for a motion for default judgment, and the judge said, they willfully and intentionally violated the Freedom of Information Act and ordered them to produce the records within 5 days and pay attorney's fees and a $5,000 penalty. Of course, as you know, that deadline came and went, so we had another court, we made another motion, had another court date set for earlier this week, the 11th it was. In between then, we even sent them another, I'm not 100% sure of the wording, but we served them the papers again, just in case they missed it. Still missed the court date, and that's when the next day, that same day we wrote the story, the next day we talked to the governor.
Yeah, that's right.
Of course,
you got a chance to ask the governor about this not once but twice this week. Once at the butter cow unveiling, and then at the ribbon cutting, where the governor took questions both times. What was the governor's response here?
Yeah, he told me either through a mix-up of the notification process or some mix-up, they didn't know about the court date. Was his line, and so they absolutely want to show up, he said. It's not like they're avoiding it. He gave his vote of confidence to the director and assured me they will be at the hearing on September 9th. One interesting note here is DCFS had sent me an initial statement saying, oh yeah, there was a miscommunication. We'll try to get to the bottom of it. And then that's when I returned to them our affidavits that, we had served them twice. And then they sent a second follow-up statement saying, I quote, unfortunately, there was a significant miscommunication within the department regarding this matter. The department will explain the situation in detail to the court. The department did not and would never intentionally disregard the directions of a court or miss a court appearance. The department is committed to working toward a favorable outcome for all parties as soon as possible. So, sounds like we might get some clarity on September 9th, but we are still trying to get to the bottom of what happened to Mackenzie.
And that's really the more important aspect of the story is that this girl, young woman, 18 years old, died in state custody. She was under the care of DCFS in foster care, and we still don't know all of the circumstances behind her passing, as well as who was responsible, and what about
Yeah,
the people
well,
who were responsible for looking after her.
yeah, well, her foster mother and foster grandmother have been charged with murder. They are being held, but the state has some level of oversight there, and that's just we can't get that clarity without the personnel records, without these documents that are the judge has agreed we have a right, the public has a right to see.
Okay. Well, we'll be back with more on that following the September 9th hearing. Another story this week involved an issue where the state of Illinois is responding to an action by the Trump administration. This time it involves childhood immunizations. This is important to anyone who has young children at home who need to get immunization records to enroll those kids in school. Ben, there have been some changes in federal guidelines about those vaccines. Can you tell us what those changes are and how the state of Illinois is responding to it?
Yeah, President Trump signed an executive order earlier in the week, basically trying to tell states that they need to change their vaccine policies to conform with the new federal guidelines that President Trump and Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. have conceived. Really, one of the main highlights that has troubled many public health experts in this is separating out the MMR vaccine, that's measles, mumps, and rubella. Public health experts, including the head of the Illinois Department of Public Health, said this is just a straight up bad idea that is going to cause more public health risks for children. It also de-emphasized certain vaccines like hepatitis A and B, the flu, COVID-19. Instead of being recommended for all children, they're now recommended, at least at the federal level, for certain high-risk groups or based on decision making between a patient and the doctor. The president calls this the gold standard, but the state is going to continue to follow the guidelines from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which it adopted back in February. These guidelines are the same guidelines that many parents have been following for a very long time, where the MMR vaccine is recommended to be taken all in one shot and not separated out into 3 different shots and 3 different appointments like President Trump thinks it should be, that the flu shot, COVID-19 are routine childhood vaccinations that should happen every year. So the state is going to continue following those guidelines from a very well-respected medical institution rather than following new guidelines that the federal government has come up with.
All right. Well, finally, I want to close with a few words about the Chicago Bears. We reported at the end of the legislative session that both the House and the Senate passed separate but different bills that were aimed at keeping the Bears in Illinois by helping them build a new stadium, even if that meant moving them to the suburbs. It was assumed that negotiations would continue and maybe a deal would be struck that could pass both houses during the fall veto session. The Chicago Tribune reported this week, though, that the Bears really haven't been talking with the state of Illinois or Illinois lawmakers much at all since the end of the session, and they are still focused on a site or sites across the border in Hammond, Indiana. Brendan, you've been following this, and you were there asking the governor some questions about it during the fair opening events. Is this a deal? I mean, are the Bears set on moving to Indiana, or is this just more posturing on the part of the Bears ownership?
Posturing. So earlier in the week, there was a lot of speculation, rampant, especially on social media, that there would be some big announcement this week from the Bears that they may be finalizing a deal to go to Indiana, that they may even change their name to include Indiana in the name of Chicago Bears. Well, none of that happened. And we shouldn't necessarily be surprised at this point because this is kind of more par for the course over the past, 5 years or so. The Bears basically gave a status update that said they did their due diligence on what's known as the Lost Marsh site in Hammond, and they confirmed that they are doing work on an adjacent site called the Wolf Lake Terminal, but that is ongoing. So basically, they're still doing their due diligence in Indiana. They did confirm that they are still talking to Illinois officials, having occasional talks, but both Kevin Warren, the team president, and team chairman George McCaskey said that those have been minimal talks, and that checks with what sources have been telling me and obviously other reporters, that there just hasn't been a lot of movement in Illinois on the Bears over the past couple of months since the session ended without a deal, and since the Bears board voted to focus on Hammond. But they're not closing the door in Illinois. I think that's probably the big takeaway here. That despite maybe inching forward in Hammond, they are far from closing the deal there, and there still seems to be an opportunity for Illinois lawmakers. Perhaps in the veto session, Governor Pritzker reiterated that he wants to keep the Bears in Illinois, but that the team has to present to him and to legislators a plan that can pass the General Assembly and get the governor's signature. That, yes, they know that the Bears want property tax certainty, but now that they've seen what can pass the House, what can pass the Senate, adjust accordingly. And the Bears haven't really done that work. So it'll be fascinating to see over the next few weeks and months if they do decide to maybe be less passive and more active in their talks with Illinois, if they are still open to building at the site they own in Arlington Heights.
So whose move is it in this little chess game?
That's a great question, Peter. Each side right now seems to think it's the other person's move. Kevin Warren said yesterday that we don't have an offer on the table from Illinois, making it seem like the ball's in Illinois' court to court the Bears. But then Governor Pritzker reiterated that again, it's on the Bears to do this work, to get the votes that they need, draft the legislative language, work with their lobbyists to get a plan that can actually pass in Illinois. And Chairman George McCaskey was asked this by a reporter of, are you saying you want Illinois lawmakers to come to you? And he's like, not necessarily. Like, we're adults. We can have a conversation if there's a conversation to be had. But right now, both sides seem to be kind of on the sidelines waiting for the other to make a move. So I suppose it's a matter of, who blinks first.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. I want to thank Ben Selinsky, Brendan Moore, and Jerry Nowicki for being here this week. If you enjoyed this podcast, feel free to click the like button on your podcast app. You can also subscribe to our YouTube page and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and other social media. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.